freezing winter evening, as snowflakes danced through the air, a frail elderly woman stood by the corner of a nearly deserted parking lot. The glow of holiday lights flickered on the icy pavement, casting a fleeting sparkle on the otherwise gray night. Cars rumbled past, their drivers focused on reaching warm homes and family gatherings, barely noticing the woman wrapped in a worn-out coat, her fingers stiff from the cold as she carefully arranged handcrafted wreaths and holly bouquets on a rickety wooden table. Martha had always loved Christmas. She used to bake cookies, decorate her home, and wrap gifts for her grandchildren. But that was before her husband passed, before the bills piled up, before arthritis stole the job she had relied on for years. Now, Christmas was just another reminder of everything she had lost. She had been standing there since noon, the bitter wind cutting through her layers, as people walked by, some offering polite smiles, most not noticing her at all. Then, a car pulled into the lot, its headlights momentarily blinding her. She assumed it was just another passerby on their way to the supermarket. But instead of driving past, the vehicle slowed to a stop a few feet from her table. The door opened, and out stepped a man, tall, broad, bundled in a heavy coat, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Evening," he said, his voice deep but warm. Martha straightened, smoothing the edges of her tablecloth with nervous fingers. "Good evening," she replied softly. He examined her display, his eyes lingering on the wreaths and candles. "These are beautiful," he said, carefully touching one of the arrangements. "Thank you," Martha said, her voice steadier this time. "They're handmade." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "How long have you been out here?" She hesitated but found herself answering honestly. "Since noon." He frowned. "It's freezing. Why don't you have a stand inside?" Martha let out a small, bitter laugh. "They don't allow vendors without permits, and permits cost money." The man's frown deepened. He glanced at the table again. "Are you selling these for something special?" Martha hesitated once more, but before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. "Medicine and heat for my apartment. It's so cold. And the pills." Her voice trailed off. She hated sounding desperate, but it was the truth. The man was quiet for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "I'll take everything," he said. Martha blinked, stunned. "What?" "All of it," he repeated. "Every wreath, every candle. I'll pay whatever you're asking." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she shook her head. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said gently. "I want to." She opened her mouth to protest again, but there was something in his eyes, kindness, sincerity, that made her stop. He handed her several bills, far more than she had dared hope to make that night. Her hands trembled as she accepted them. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied with a smile. "Just promise me you'll go somewhere warm tonight." She nodded quickly, blinking back tears. As he carefully gathered the wreaths and candles, stacking them in his trunk, Martha realized that, for the first time in a long while, Christmas didn't feel like just another day of loss. It felt like hope. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Snow continued to drift outside, settling on the quiet streets as Martha sat inside the small cafe, her hands wrapped tightly around the warm cup of tea Shaq had bought for her. The heat seeped into her fingers, chasing away the numbing chill that had settled into her bones after hours of standing in the cold. The cafe was simple but inviting, its yellow lights casting a soft glow over faded holiday garlands strung along the walls. Outside the large front window, the snowflakes blurred the world beyond the glass, making everything feel softer, quieter. Shaq sat across from her, his massive frame making the small table between them seem even smaller. His presence was steady, grounding, though Martha still felt the weight of her own insecurities pressing down on her. She had hesitated when he offered to take her somewhere warm, but his kindness had been disarming, and in the end, exhaustion had won out. Now, as she sipped her tea, she felt gratitude battling with a deep-seated embarrassment. Better? Shaq asked, breaking the silence. Martha looked up, startled for a moment before nodding. Yes, thank you. Her voice, though still soft, no longer trembled. Shaq leaned back slightly, steadying her. You don't have to thank me, he said. But I do have to ask, why were you out there in this weather, selling flowers and wreaths like that? Martha set her cup down carefully, her gaze dropping to the table as if searching for an answer written in the grain of the wood. People rarely asked about her life. Most passed by without noticing her, and the ones who did stop often offered either pity or judgment, neither of which she had the strength to face. But Shaq's question wasn't filled with pity. It was genuine. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like someone actually wanted to listen. I didn't have a choice, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Shaq didn't push. He just waited. Martha took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. I used to be a florist, she began. Had my own little shop not far from here. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. I loved it, especially around the holidays. Christmas was always the busiest time of year, but it was also the most joyful. People came in to buy wreaths, poinsettias, candles, ribbons. I loved helping them pick out the perfect decoration, watching their faces light up when they found something they loved. She paused, her eyes growing distant, lost in the warmth of the memory. My husband, Frank, used to help me with the heavy lifting. He'd deliver orders to customers, keep the shop looking nice. We made a good team. Shaq noticed the way her voice softened when she spoke about her husband. But then, just as quickly, something shifted. The warmth in her eyes faded. He passed away 5 years ago, she said quietly. Heart attack. It was sudden. One day he was there, and the next. Her voice trailed off. Shaq leaned forward, his voice gentle. I'm sorry. Martha nodded, brushing a stray tear away before it could fall. After that, everything changed. I couldn't keep up with the shop on my own. Bills started piling up, and I had to let it go. I took cleaning jobs to make ends meet, but my knees, they're not what they used to be. Arthritis, the doctor said, made it harder and harder to keep up, and eventually, they let me go too. Shaq exhaled slowly. He had met so many people struggling just to stay afloat, but something about Martha's story made it feel personal. She wasn't lazy. She wasn't irresponsible. She had worked hard her entire life, and still, life had taken more than its share from her. Why not ask your family for help? He asked carefully. Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. I have 2 children, she said, her voice measured. Both grown. My daughter moved to the West Coast after she got married. My son. She hesitated, then looked away. We don't talk much anymore. He has his own problems. Shame flickered in her expression. I didn't want to be a burden. I thought I could manage on my own. But then the medical bills started coming in. The heating costs went up. I started making the wreaths and bouquets to earn a little extra money. Shaq ran a hand over his chin, exhaling slowly. And that's why you were out there tonight. Martha nodded. I needed enough to pay for my prescription. And a few groceries. Maybe a little extra to keep the heat on through the weekend. Her voice broke slightly, and she quickly took a sip of tea, as if hoping the warmth would steady her. For a long moment, Shaq didn't say anything. He just let her words settle between them. Then, finally, he spoke. You're not a burden. Martha looked up, her eyes wide. What? You're not a burden, Shaq repeated. His voice was firm, steady, like he wanted her to hear it, to really hear it. Martha blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in his words. For so long, she had carried that weight, that quiet belief that needing help was the same as being a burden. But as she looked at Shaq, at the man who had stopped in the cold, who had bought everything she was selling without hesitation, who had brought her here simply so she could be warm for a little while, something inside her shifted. Maybe, just maybe, this Christmas would be different. Snow fell softly outside Martha's motel window as she stirred beneath the thick blanket, the unfamiliar sensation of warmth wrapping around her like a dream. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The quiet hum of the heater, the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting from the small kitchenette, it all felt surreal, like waking up in someone else's life. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the soft glow of morning light, reality settled back in. She sat up slowly, her stiff joints protesting, but the ache felt lighter now. Glancing around the room, she noticed the neatly folded clothes on the chair, a small basket of toiletries, and, on the table near the window, a vase holding a bouquet of her own flowers. Her breath caught in her throat. It had been so long since anyone had shown her kindness like this. Pressing a hand to her mouth, she fought back the wave of emotions rising in her chest. On the counter beside the coffee mug, a note in Shaq's handwriting read, "Rest today. We'll talk more tomorrow. You're not alone." Martha sank into the chair, clutching the mug as if it might anchor her to this new reality. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to find out. That afternoon, a knock at the door startled her. Setting down her empty cup, she moved carefully to answer it, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Shaq standing there, holding 2 large bags and flashing that same warm, steady smile. "Good afternoon," he said. "How are you feeling?" Martha stepped aside, letting him in. "Better," she admitted. "Warmer. Thank you for all of this. I still don't understand why you're doing it." Shaq set the bags down on the table and met her gaze. "Because I can," he said simply, echoing the words he had spoken the night before. "And because I believe everyone deserves a chance to feel safe and cared for. Especially at Christmas." Martha felt her throat tighten, but she quickly busied herself unpacking the bags. Inside, she found warm clothes, a thick sweater, gloves, a scarf, along with fresh groceries, fruit, vegetables, bread, and even a small tin of cookies wrapped in festive ribbon. She ran her fingers over the soft fabric of the sweater, unable to find the words to express what she was feeling. "There's more coming," Shaq said, watching her carefully. "But I wanted to start with this. And there's someone I want you to meet." Martha looked up, confused, as a woman stepped into the room behind him. Dressed in a smart coat and carrying a clipboard, she offered a warm, reassuring smile. "This is Lisa," Shaq explained. "She runs the family assistance program at my foundation. She's going to help us get things sorted out." Lisa stepped forward and extended her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Martha. Shaq told me a little about your situation, and I'm here to help. We're going to start by making sure you have everything you need in the short term, and then we'll work on longer-term options, housing, medical care, maybe even a business plan, if you're interested in continuing to sell your arrangements." Martha hesitated, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of support. "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured. Lisa shook her head gently. "You're not a burden," she said firmly. "You're someone who's been through a tough time and just needs a little help getting back on her feet. That's what we're here for." Martha swallowed hard and nodded. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. Lisa walked Martha through applications for assistance programs, secured a temporary apartment for her, and mapped out the next steps. By the time they finished, Martha felt like she had run a marathon, but for the first time in years, it was a race she could see herself winning. In the days that followed, Shaq and Lisa returned regularly, bringing more supplies, helping her settle into her new space. The apartment was small but warm, with a cozy armchair by the window and a little kitchen where Martha could prepare meals without struggling against the cold. She found herself waking up each morning to the hum of a heater instead of the bite of winter air, to the scent of coffee instead of exhaustion. And slowly, the weight she had carried for so long began to lift. Shaq had told her she wasn't a burden. That she had worked hard, sacrificed, and kept going even when it felt impossible. That wasn't weakness, it was strength. And maybe, just maybe, he was right. For the first time in a long time, Christmas didn't feel like a season of loss. It felt like hope. More than enough. Martha stood in the middle of her small apartment, looking at the boxes of supplies, the ribbons, the greenery, everything she needed to keep creating. A quiet smile spread across her face as she ran her fingers over a spool of deep red satin ribbon, already envisioning the wreaths she would make next. For the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't just surviving, she was planning, dreaming. She brewed herself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the space, and sat at the little dining table. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily through the morning light, dusting the rooftops and sidewalks in a soft white glow. She glanced over at the note Shaq had left her the night before, still sitting beside the vase of flowers. This is just the beginning. And for once, she believed it. A week ago, she had been standing on a frozen street corner, her hands numb from the cold, feeling invisible to the world. Now, she was here, in a warm home, with a future unfolding before her. She had no idea where this path would lead, but for the first time in years, she was excited to find out. She picked up a sprig of holly, twirling it between her fingers, and reached for her scissors. There was work to do, beautiful, fulfilling work. And this time, she wasn't doing it alone. Later that afternoon, as the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the frost-lined windows, a familiar knock sounded at Martha's door. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, her heart already lifting at the thought of who it might be. When she opened the door, there stood Shaq, his broad frame nearly filling the doorway, his arms brimming with grocery bags and supplies. But what caught her completely off guard was the small Christmas tree he was balancing under one arm, already decorated with twinkling lights, bright ornaments, and a golden star perched at the top. She let out a surprised laugh as he angled the tree sideways, trying, and failing, to maneuver it through the narrow entryway without knocking into the walls. "I swear, this door got smaller since last time," he muttered, his lips twitching with amusement as he finally squeezed it through. Setting the tree down in the corner of the room, he stepped back and dusted off his hands. "It's not much," he said, glancing at her with a smile. "But every home needs a tree at Christmas." Martha stared at the tree, something deep and warm blooming inside her chest. The soft glow of the lights reflected in her eyes as she took a slow breath, letting the moment settle over her. For so many years, Christmas had become just another day, a painful reminder of what she had lost. But now, standing in this small but warm apartment, with the scent of pine in the air and the gentle flicker of lights casting soft shadows on the walls, it felt different. It felt like hope. "It's perfect," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Shaq gave her a nod, then looked around the apartment, taking in the changes. The once bare space now had small but meaningful touches, a cozy blanket draped over the arm of the chair, a vase of flowers on the table, and the faint scent of cinnamon lingering in the air. "You've done a lot with this place already," he said, his voice filled with quiet approval. "It feels like home." Martha glanced around as well, then nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's starting to," she admitted. Shaq pulled out a chair at the small dining table and sat down as Martha moved to pour them both a cup of tea. The sound of the kettle whistling filled the room, mingling with the quiet hum of the heater. As she placed the cups on the table, he leaned forward, resting his arms on the surface. "So, what's next for you?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. Martha wrapped her hands around the warmth of her mug, staring into the steam as she considered the question. A week ago, she wouldn't have had an answer. A week ago, she had been focused on nothing more than surviving another cold night. But now? She lifted her gaze, her eyes steady. "I want to keep going," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I want to keep making these arrangements. But not just for me, I want to help other people too. People who might be where I was." Shaq's lips curled into a slow smile, as if he had been waiting for exactly that answer. "I was hoping you'd say that." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity, unlike anything Martha had experienced in years. With Shaq's foundation supporting her, she set up workshops to teach others how to craft wreaths and holiday decorations, sharing not only her skills but her story. She spoke to the participants with honesty, showing them that no matter how much life had taken from them, it was still possible to rebuild. Her small business began to grow. Orders trickled in at first, then flooded her tiny workspace as word spread. Soon, she was filling requests for weddings, holiday events, and custom arrangements. Before long, she was able to hire a few other women who had struggled just as she had, giving them the same chance Shaq had given her. Then, as Christmas approached the following year, Martha found herself standing in the very same market where her journey had begun. But this time, everything was different. Her booth, once a small table on a freezing street corner, was now a bright, welcoming space filled with handcrafted arrangements, delicate wreaths, and festive decorations. The air was rich with the scent of pine and fresh flowers, and strings of warm fairy lights framed her stall, making everything feel magical. Customers she recognized from the year before stopped by, greeting her warmly, asking how she had been. But this time, she wasn't just another vendor on the street, she was part of the market, part of something bigger. And, as always, Shaq stopped by too. Martha spotted him easily, his towering frame unmistakable even in the bustling crowd. She smiled as she reached under the table, pulling out a carefully wrapped wreath, the best one she had made. "This one's for you," she said, handing it to him. Shaq took it, turning it over in his hands, his eyes tracing the careful details, the perfectly woven branches, the bright red berries, the intricate touches that made it uniquely hers. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "Just like everything else you've done." Martha felt her throat tighten as she looked around at all she had built, at everything she had overcome. "I wouldn't be here without you," she said softly. Shaq shook his head, his expression steady but gentle. "You would have gotten here eventually," he said. "I just gave you a little push." Martha let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Maybe," she said. "But I promise you this, I'll keep pushing for others. Just like you pushed for me." Shaq grinned, nodding in approval. "That's all I could ever ask for." The market buzzed around them, filled with the sounds of holiday music, the laughter of families, the warmth of a season that, for so long, had felt distant to Martha. But now, Christmas wasn't just a reminder of what she had lost. It was a celebration of everything she had gained. As she watched Shaq disappear into the crowd, she knew one thing for certain: she would never forget what he had done for her. But more importantly, she would carry his kindness forward, spreading it to others who needed it just as much as she once had. For Martha, this wasn't just a second chance. It was the beginning of a new life. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Explore more inspiring stories with us, each one a reminder of the power of kindness and hope. Share this video with friends and family to spread the message of compassion and second chances. Stay tuned for more heartfelt stories.